To say we are all sexual perverts, it is quite strong. It's kind of a potent statement. But I actually think it's true. I mean, if you look deeply enough at individual sort of arousal patterns, not necessarily things that they act on, but things that they are aroused by. I mean, if we go all the way back to their early adolescence and things that they've done, maybe that they haven't shared with anybody, things that have turned them on, perhaps. You know, the brain mechanisms and their genital twinges and all those types of very sort of low-level types of arousal responses, somebody in the world would see them as a pervert as a consequence of that. So with perhaps the exception of somebody without any sexual orientation, the so-called asexuals, these are people that say that they've never been aroused by either men or women or of any age group or animals or objects or anything along those lines. With them perhaps excluded, I do think that we are all sexual perverts if you look deeply enough and sort of analyze it at the right level, yes.
Have you done any research into this area and looked at the vast array of so-called perhaps perversions one could define as?
Right.
Have you done, and what have you found?
Paraphilia is theoretically the most interesting by virtue of the fact that these people are only aroused by a certain very clearly defined set of erotic stimuli. Whereas most people have some sort of broader range of what they could potentially be aroused by. Somebody with a paraphilia can only be aroused by a very specific type of stimulus. And there are as many as 547, I think was the last count, distinct paraphilias that have been identified in the literature. And they run the spectrum all the way from being aroused by the sun's rays to being aroused by horses, to being aroused by sneezing. They're all over the place. I mean, basically any object in the world that exists is potentially a sexual object. This sort of subjective attributions that we eroticize them. So anybody with a paraphilia is still pretty much called a pervert, and we get away with calling them perverts because they're not really protected in the same way that, say, somebody with a minority sexual orientation that is much more common, like homosexuality is.
Should they be protected?
I think they should be, yeah, and maybe that's my dangerous idea, really, because if just because you have a paraphilia doesn't mean that you've actually committed some type of social transgression, that you've harmed somebody. So what defines the paraphilias is simply the psychological desire. You don't have to act on the desire to be considered to have a paraphilia. The worst case scenario, I think from contemporary standards, is a pedophile. You could still be a pedophile, not act on those desires. The pedophilia sort of captures your innate sexual, whether you call it an orientation or just sort of a set of desires, doesn't say anything about anything else about yourself or sort of your moral qualities or your social judgment, anything along those lines. In fact, there are pedophiles that are very good at inhibiting their desires because they know the harm, the drastic harm that they could cause to children.
You don't think they're mental illnesses?
I do think that there are mental illnesses, and I should say that there are a number of paraphilias that are considered to be mental illnesses, no matter whether the person believes they're ill or not. And to be considered that way, they have to inherently threaten or harm the well-being of others. So pedophilia is one of them, voyeurism is another one, exhibitionism is another, frotcherism where you touch people in public. Sadomasochism is sort of one of those slippery areas because lots of people engage in sadomasochism and it's not harmful to them even though they're being caused physical pain. So that's sort of an interesting area too.
How did you get into this area? Because you're an evolutionary psychologist, right?
Right.
What's piqued your interest about this area?
Well, I think there are many ways to answer that question. I mean, I'm gay, so I think, you know, being raised in a fairly conservative Midwest area of the country in the U.S., I grew up in Ohio. You know, most of the people that I knew were fairly conservative and religious, and I knew probably from a very early age, when I was at least 10 years old, that I was gay and I was attracted to men. But I couldn't share that with anybody. I didn't come out of the closet till at least my late teens. I think I was 19 when I told my mother. And not to be able to share that sort of burdensome secret, I think, really affected me in interesting ways in terms of constantly monitoring how I'm presenting myself and the information that I'm giving to other people. But it caused a sense of shame, I think, this sort of palpable sense of shame for something that I had absolutely no control over. So I think as a consequence of that, I've been sympathetic to underdogs that similarly have no control over their atypical sexual desire patterns or responses. This is who they are. It doesn't necessarily mean anything else about who they are as individuals. And in fact, there's no meaningful correlations between having a paraphilia and anything else about your psychological profile. It doesn't mean that you have low intelligence, for example, or have difficulty inhibiting your actions or anything along those lines. They're completely separate.
I think the difficulty, though, that people might have with paraphilia is that they're almost like little warning signs of potential damage that people can do to other people. You raised pedophilia. Yeah. Often people talk about having these tendencies or these thoughts well before they act on them. Mm-hmm. So in that case, well, how do you view that? You know, in terms of your paradigm of, well, we should just accept that certain people have these views or these impulses.
Right. Well, first of all, these paraphilias, including pedophilia, they're not going away anytime soon. And one of the problems is that we've looked at it as sort of an essentialized evil. And therefore, these pedophiles are basically going underground, and who knows what's happening sort of behind the scenes. I think that if there were an environment, a social sort of milieu, or an atmosphere where these things could be talked about openly and frankly, that would probably be beneficial in terms of actually protecting children.
How would you talk about it, though?
How would you talk about it with people who... Well, I think you need to change the social environment to make it an environment that it is seen as a, as a psychiatric disorder potentially, that somebody, people understand, and experts, clinicians, professionals, psychiatrists, they understand that this is not something that is sort of inherently flawed about the individual. They have no control over it. And allow the therapist or the counselor or the expert to help them control those types of drives or those types of desires.
At what point do you think paraphilias are evil or wrong?
Well, I would never use the word evil sort of in referring to these, but I do think that if we're going to use a term like immoral, for instance, it needs to be reserved to actually causing distress or harm on an actual subjectively experiencing organism, whether that's another human being or an animal in the case of people who commit bestiality, for instance. I think that to refer to somebody who has a psychological profile as being immoral, even in the absence of acting on that, is just doesn't make a lot of sense. If something is immoral, that means that it should be reserved for behaviors that actually transgress on other people's well-being. It actually causes harm or distress. And it also shouldn't be used for causing harm to sort of abstract symbolic entities. So it's destructive to society, or it's bad for the institution of marriage. Those types of abstract symbolic entities don't have brains that could actually be harmed. They don't have subjectively experiencing emotions that can be affected by our actions. So I think when we say that it's deleterious to society, or it's bad for the institution of marriage, or even if it goes against God, that's not the right way to sort of perceive these types of phenomena. It should be reserved to actual behaviors against other subjectively experiencing organisms.
And finally, were there any paraphilias that you found shocking or puzzling?
Almost all of them. I mean, I found, that's the interesting and the difficult thing about doing research in this area, is to put ourselves into somebody else's shoes. And speaking of somebody else's shoes, people who are aroused by shoes, for instance, or somebody else that's aroused by feet or whatever, and I hate feet. I find them absolutely disgusting. So being aroused by these types of things and to put myself into these people's shoes and try to understand where they're coming from is a very difficult task. So yeah, almost all the paraphilias are incredibly difficult for anybody who is more, I guess, vanilla, sort of mainstream in their sexual response pattern. It's weird, it's exotic, it's foreign, but it's interesting to me, and it sort of captures sexual diversity. So yeah, I mean, here's an interesting sort of philosophical problem. There's a guy that was a attracted to people with amputations, women who had amputated appendages. So he deliberately sought out prostitutes that were missing an arm or leg, and he had a history of this. And he traced it back to a very discrete event in his early childhood, where his first masturbation experience was with his father, who was a physician. He had a textbook, and there were images of women that had amputations, and this was his first exposure to naked women. They just happened to have amputations, and that somehow got stamped into his brain as being sort of the most desirable type of woman. So for the rest of his life, basically, he was limited in his attraction to amputated women. Anyway, to make a long story short, he eventually found a wife that had a missing arm, I believe. She had a congenital deformity, and it required amputation when she was young. And they were happy enough. They had children. They living in sort of a very domestic life. And then one day she was sort of on his computer, and she discovered a hoard of pornography of amputated women. And she discovered that he was an acrotomophile. This is acrotomophilia is the name of this particular paraphilia, being attracted to amputees. And she left him because of that, because she felt deceived. So I think it's an interesting sort of ethical, philosophical question, because on the one hand, why is it any different than him just being attracted to blonde women or women that were, tall or had blue eyes or something like that? He just happened to prefer women that had a missing limb. But she felt like this is something that he should have shared with her. But the problem, of course, was that he had so much shame for his particular paraphilia that he couldn't tell her that the reason he was attracted to her is because she was missing her arm. This is a sore subject for her, probably. And that's maybe sort of not a very common type of scenario, but it's an interesting one, and I think it illustrates our concerns about what other people are attracted to and what is normal, what's abnormal, and what's acceptable in terms of our desire patterns and our responses.